Good afternoon. This is Marion McGregor speaking, and I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Human Rights, Equity and Inclusion. Welcome to day 4 of our Inclusion Week and the final event to wrap up our just the wonderful series that we've had this week. Before we begin or go any further, I'll turn to my colleague, Jaleh, also at the Center for Human Rights, to start us off in a good way through our land acknowledgement. Jaleh?
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jaleh. Welcome. As this meeting is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same place, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. To offer now a reflection on this land acknowledgement, I invite my colleague, Melissa Theodore.
Thank you, Jaleh. A critical reflection in relation to Indigenous lands and organizing across difference is the need to recognize that Indigenous lands are often bisected and divided through historical and current colonial governments like Canada, who have taken land for its own purposes. The settler process of acquiring Indigenous lands created borders. So we have to remember that provincial and international borders, like those between the lands we now call Canada and the US, these borders run through, across, and over Indigenous territories that were taken up as part of treaty, forced surrenders, and theft. Before these borders existed, Indigenous peoples organized themselves in unique ways and carried protocol for moving throughout territories or across territorial borders. Over time, this dynamic and complex organization of Indigenous territories came under attack through process of imposed cultural erasure, the stealing of land and its resources, and the other trappings of colonization. We also recognize that colonialism and imperialism is happening elsewhere today in places like Ukraine, Afghanistan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and other countries. It's important for us to take the opportunity to recognize that while we may not always see the solidarities that exist between Indigenous peoples who now live divided across colonial borders, these solidarities continue to exist behind the veil of colonial imposition, and more so in ways that are present, alive, and real today. I'll now pass it on to Marion McGregor.
Thank you, Melissa. This is Marion speaking. Thank you, Melissa, for that reflection and an opportunity for us to engage with the land acknowledgement in a reflective way and how it connects with our work today. I always appreciate the opportunity to do that. Thank you, everyone, for attending our final day of Inclusion Week, and welcome to all our York community members. I encourage you to follow on Twitter the hashtag Inclusion Week to join in on the conversation. This year's series has been highlighting the intentional quest for equitable, just, and caring futures. Yesterday's keynote, led by Ruben Gastambide Fernandez, touched upon what it means to be in solidarity as a verb, as a creative process, and always in relationship to others. He invited everyone to reflect on the last time you claimed to be in solidarity. With whom were you in solidarity? What mental image did you create of them? How familiar or strange were they? What experiences and assumptions shaped the image you have of those you claim to be in solidarity with? This invitation is a starting point for today's conversation on solidarity and liberation. When we talk about solidarity and when we talk about solidarity and liberation, one important theme is how to organize across differences. Struggles for racial justice and liberation are made possible through the efforts of organized and dedicated people who identify overlapping interests and find common causes, even when their perspectives may differ. Beyond holding a belief that a world is possible, beyond holding a belief that a better world is possible, struggles undertaken in solidarity involve dialogue, mutual support, and the recognition of interdependence. We are joined today by our panelists, Shanice Ann Steele, Professor Wajime Osman, and Sabina Chatterjee, who share their own experiences building community and organizing in solidarity across various communities. And their conversations will be moderated by Jaleh Afshar and Melissa Theodore from our Center for Human Rights here at York. And because I may not have a moment at the end, I do also want to thank all of the staff at the Center for Human Rights, of which I am very proud to lead and to work with, for their efforts this week in all of the events that have made Inclusion Week. And I'm very pleased now to pass this over to Melissa, who will lead us in the panelist discussion. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Marianne. So before we begin the panel discussion, I'd just like to go over some housekeeping and technical notes. Please note that we have French, ASL, and auto transcription in English of the live discussion. On the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can select the interpretation button to choose English or French. In case you need support at any point during the session, please connect with my colleagues Dahlia and Lisa. You can reach them through a separate Zoom meeting, which will require you to step away from this Zoom. And the meeting support is available at a Zoom link, which was just shared by Dahlia in the chat. You can also follow hashtag Inclusion Week on Twitter to join in on the conversation. And while there will be guided questions to frame this conversation, we'll also want to give this conversation room to branch out, shift, and develop as organically as possible. During the 50-minute mark, we will wrap up by asking the panelists to say final words before transitioning to question and answers. And to move over to the panel discussion, I would like to invite my colleague, Jaleh.
Thank you, Melissa. This is Jaleh. We'll be opening our space today for a conversation between Shanice Ann Steele, Wajma Osman, and Sabina Chatterjee on solidarity and liberation. And in the spirit of shared leadership, this conversation will take place in rounds where we'll see a topic on the screen and our speakers will share stories and insights with one another. So for this first round, I'll invite our speakers to introduce themselves, beginning first with Shanice Ann Steele, followed by Sabina Chatterjee, and then finally Wajma Osman. Hello, everybody. Anin. My name is Shanice Steele. I'm going to introduce myself in my language first. So, Anin Bojo Buju, Shanice Indishnakas, Indobo de Go Anishnabemnon, Jajak Indodem, Anishnabe Meiti Makade Kwe, Toronto Dunjaba, Minwa Nabising Dunjaba, Debenjamin Nakuya Potawatomi. So I said, hello, my name is Shanice Steele. My Anishinaabe name is Ndowobo, which means to carry the ceremony. I'm Crane Clan, and I'm Afro-Indigenous. So my father hails from Trinidad with roots in Carriacou, Grenada, which is a very small island. Everyone knows who you are by what your face looks like. They can tell you their entire family. I'm also Nabising Métis or Nipissing Métis. My mother is mixed of French and Irish and Indigenous ancestry. And so I walk in multiple worlds. I am also a queer fat person, which dictates and navigates how I move through the world and how I interact with others. I am a writer, an educator, an activist. I do anything that is community work because community is the most important thing to me. You usually will catch me in a dopakong, and if you've heard that word before, it sounds like a tobacco. A tobacco is the anglicized version of a dopakong, and a dopakong means the place of many trees. And I actually grew up about 5 minutes from York University at Keele and Sentinel. That's where I spent most of my time. And so York University is in the place of my people, the place of many trees. And if you've been to York University, you probably look around and there's a lot of buildings now. So it doesn't always seem like a place of many trees, but it once was. And my grandparents grew up in that area when it still was a place of many trees. I'm so honored to be here with you all today and to talk about this amazing topic. I'm excited to hear what the other panelists have to say. And I just want to say Chimigwech and Marcy for allowing me to share space with you all today and for you allowing me to become a part of your community and you becoming a part of mine. Chimigwech.
I wasn't sure if I was just supposed to go. So hello, my name is Sabina Chatterjee, and I am really grateful to be here. And let's see, my family's roots are in Bangladesh, in India, and in Germany. I grew up on land that's held the stories and connections of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and neutral peoples since time immemorial. And in India, often people here don't talk about the Indigenous people in India. So in India and Bangladesh, my family has been on Chautal, Chakma, Marma, Mandi land. And I grew up being, I'm the youngest of 3 kids. My parents moved here because they didn't think they could raise mixed kids in Germany or in India. And so that's how we ended up here. I grew up with lots of stories about the fight for independence from the British in India, and stories of deep valuing of history and relationships to land, but that held glaring disconnects when it came to talking about the land that we were on here. I think especially within an interracial family, there was the sense of not fitting in, but also that sort of, from my parents anyway, that desire to be model minorities, in quotes. And so thinking and talking about the land that we lived on and the people whose relationships had been so deeply disrupted through historic and ongoing colonial violence was something where we didn't have that many opportunities to talk about that in school and other places. But in my early 20s, I had the deep pleasure of being part of Dish Pradesh, which was home away from home. And it was a festival of South Asian culture and politics. And one of the most amazing things that happened within that was the foregrounding of complexities of belonging and unbelonging. So weaving together how culture and celebration and also marginalizations happened within our own communities because of queerness, because of indentureship, because of different histories and connections to how families had moved from places in South Asia. And the fact that throughout all of that, there was also a very strong commitment to acknowledging the land that we were on, but going beyond that and thinking about relationships and solidarities. And I also have had the deep pleasure of working with street involved youth in Ontario and on the West Coast, and working with organizations supporting youth, finding ways that solidarity can be woven into how we do our work with one another, how we hold one another up, and how accountability and celebration need to be a big part of that complexity. So I'm really looking forward to the conversations today.
Hi, everyone. I'm looking forward to the conversation we're about to have too. And I thank York University, Jale, Melissa, everyone for making this inclusion week possible and having these important conversations. My name is Wajma Usman, and I am an Afghan-American filmmaker, writer, and activist based in Philadelphia, which is the ancestral home of the Lenape. I'm also a refugee of war as part of the first wave of Afghan refugee migration, which happened during the Cold War. And so much of my work has been impacted by that, and I see through that lens. I'm currently an assistant professor of media studies and production at Temple University. And so some of what I look at and study through my work, through my scholarship and writing and filmmaking, is the representation of Middle Eastern people, Muslim people, South Asian people in the media, and how, that causes real material damage and other negative consequences to us as a people. And also thinking about how our struggles are interconnected in the new homes that we find ourselves in, the countries that inform our hybrid positionalities. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists, for those beautiful introductions. So now at this time, we will move into the questions that we have today. So as this first question reads here, what overarching structures uphold oppression in your communities? What are threads that bind our different struggles together? And before you answer this question, I just wanted to thank all three of you for mentioning and recognizing the land that you are currently living and working on. So yeah, let's move into the question itself. So what overarching structures uphold oppression in your communities, and what are the threads that bind our struggles together? I'd like to, at this time, invite all the panelists to turn your cameras and mics on, and we will go in order of Shanice, Wajma, and Sabina for this first question.
Thank you so much for this question, Melissa. When I think of what are the overarching systems that affect my community, the Canadian government, like the colonial structure itself affects my communities, and not just my community in the context of Canada, but also my community in the context of the Caribbean. Canada's mining infrastructures, farming infrastructures negatively affect Black Caribbean people specifically, but also as an Indigenous person living in a colonial system that was set up for my people to no longer exist. That is an overarching system. The education system oftentimes is an overarching system that oppresses my communities or works in partnership with the oppression of my communities. When I think of the lack of access to adequate education for racialized children, on reserve children receive about $5,000 to $7,000 less per student than a school off reserve does. Oftentimes they're using curriculums that don't even make sense to their territory. So a great example is in Nunavut. They're using the Alberta education curriculum, which does not make sense to their landscape, to their peoples, to their communities. And as a young Black person growing up in quote unquote the hood, my access to education was limited. I remember being 14 years old and begging my mother to send me to a boarding school because I wanted access to real education and to what I thought were teachers that cared about my ability to learn and grow and move through society in a healthy way. The healthcare system is an overarching system that oppresses communities. Lack of access to adequate healthcare. Most remote communities are about 24 hours away from any form of hospital or larger medical center. Black folks very rarely get equal treatment within the medical system when they're seeking help. There's so many different overarching structures that negatively affect the communities that I belong to. I think the threads that tie my communities to other communities is the humanity. We oftentimes think of communities as numbers and data and structures as well, but not about the humanity within those communities. And so that's a thread that ties us together. I think resiliency is a thread that ties communities together. Kinship. Oftentimes we separate communities, and that's a part of dehumanizing, of not seeing your other communities as being in kinship or relationship to you, right? I think that's a big one. That could be also an overarching structure of oppression, that individualistic way of moving through society. But thinking of each other as kin. When I'm in community with other folks, all of you here, you are my kin. The work that I do is not just about liberating Black and Indigenous folks, but all people, right? And so I think that is a thread that ties us together, is our humanity and our kinship. And of course, we can start talking about higher structural levels, but I think that's the part that we miss the most and the part that I think we need to start at.
Thank you, Shanice. I'm Wajma again, and to the question of what overarching structures are oppressing my communities, I'm part of many different communities, but we have a limited time, so maybe I'll just focus on the Afghan refugee communities, because that's a group that I've been working with the new waves coming in, and some of the activist organizations that I'm a part of. And so, one of the things I wanted to highlight was that the way refugees from different parts of the world are contextualized in the media and welcomed or not welcomed, and that has to do directly with many of the important points that Shanice was making about race, and racism. And so that's definitely one of the overall arching structures of oppression. And I would also add to that, some of the things I look at in my academic work has to do with the security state apparatus, how governments militarize different parts of the world, as well as the corporate media, you know, both in the US where I am and in other countries. And all of this creates representations of people from the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa that is quite polarizing and negative. And the connection with Indigenous people in North America, as well as other Black and Brown people in the US, is that it creates these divide and conquer strategies. And so there's polarization across the board. And what we see is with movements of people coming in, there's been an increase in violent acts that are Islamophobic, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and so forth. And they've skyrocketed. And so those are, I think, all related in terms of the same structures of oppression. And I think coming together and being more deliberate about solidarity, which this panel is about, and that's something we've tried to do, is look at the structures of sexism and racism and so forth within our own communities as well, and how to go beyond that is one of the key factors. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much to both of you. I feel really honored to be talking in the same space. I think that's really lovely, the way in which Jale and Melissa have thoughtfully put us together. In terms of the overarching structures, it's interesting because there are two things that I was going to talk about. One is the overarching structure of caste. So when we're talking about, and I'm going to talk about sort of Bengali community, much to the chagrin of some folks in the Bengali community, perhaps. And I'll back up a little bit. In doing solidarity work here and always having identified as an activist, I was lucky enough to do some hard, important learning about what it meant to be in solidarity. And so through what the mainstream media talked about as the Oka crisis, but through folks in Ganzadaga and Ganawage defending their land in the 90s, we did a lot of learning about how we can support without taking over, how we can support to make sure that we don't default into, oh, but we have to be experts about other people's things, right? How do we do the work of understanding that our job is to deal with our own crap and to show up and maybe take the garbage out, right? And so what the different ways of acting in solidarity could be. And so I have, over a long period of time, brought folks together in arts-based workshops, looking at community, looking at how non-Indigenous racialized folks come together to talk about different relationships to colonization, complicities, as well as violences, and how we then hold those stories, hold those experiences to show up in solidarity. In doing my PhD right now, I'm focusing really specifically on South Asian communities. And there's a huge range of experience within that. But one of the things that keeps on coming up is the fact that caste in and of itself is anti-Indigenous and anti-Black. And that so much of what gets imported to places, to new places of home, is the crap, is the most conservative, damaging sort of ideas of community. But even for folks who are really progressive, if we don't constantly question things and trouble things, then we risk continuing violence, right? So, so for me, I grew up here, I was really involved in the anti-racist movement. As a young queer feminist, I, was part of lots of demonstrations, and, felt really honored to be there, but also uncomfortable with the fact that everybody's experiences of racism were just put together when there were so many different structures that impacted people in very particular ways. And so that then brought other conversations into play. So what is the difference between somebody who came here as a migrant by choice, or somebody whose families are the descendants of indentured workers or enslaved peoples, or who were leaving because of war and other conflicts? The diaspora, the South Asian diaspora, is so complex in and of itself. But casteism and anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Muslim racism all keep on coming with predominantly Hindu communities. And even the ways in which we celebrate, for Bengalis, Durga Puja is this huge, important celebration. We celebrate the goddess Durga, except when you look at that story, it's not a story of liberation from evil spirits. It's actually a story that is an account of killing an Indigenous king. It is a story of colonization, but that gets normalized within cultural celebration and religious celebration. And so then we need to keep on digging further, right? So if I participate in that, and yes, and yet also want to show up in solidarity with Indigenous things here, in my heart, that doesn't feel right. So how do we figure out what we need to do within our own communities to hold accountability, to question and trouble stories that have been so invisibilized that if we don't question it together, then it might remain in place, right? So, and I think that for me, being here and showing up for solidarity work necessitates that accountability. So part of my work is to gather together South Asians to say, we have such diverse histories from one another. Let's think about what our connections between place and space, and especially relationships to land, what we've learned about one another, what we've learned about indigeneity, and how we bring that here, how that operates as world making and sense making, and what needs to be disrupted. Because if we don't have community to do that, there's so much that will just, anyway, there's so much we can build in community rather than thinking about what's at stake. There's so much potential for us to be able to then engage in really rich things, rethink those celebrations, and find ways to be here that are not merely the most conservative reflection of what it means to be Bengali or Gujarati or, whichever. And to not leave people out of that conversation because their paths to here have been different. So those roots are really important. The roots of how we get here are really important, and our relationships are important. So if we can't make sense of things in relationship, then all of that resonance of what's possible in solidarity, what's possible in our own communities, is diminished. So, but those are in the academy, because there's still such a huge focus on folks who have caste privilege. Chatterjee, it's a Bengali Brahmin name. That's a hugely privileged name. Because of that, there's an overarching dismissal of casteism in a lot of places. And so there's a lot of work that needs to get done. Thanks.
Thank you, folks. Now, you all spoke about anti-Black racism. In the current context and visibility of anti-Black racism, what are the unique challenges of combating anti-Black racism, and why is it important to you to address that? And anyone can take it from here.
I'll go. Yeah, so unpacking anti-Blackness within communities extremely hard and difficult. Um, when it comes to the Indigenous community, it's complicated because it's a colonial thing. This structure of anti-Black racism is not something that's inherently a part of your community or your people. Where it comes from, and it especially was pushed through residential school eras. This idea that the darker you were, the uglier you were, the less civilized you were, right? And so for a lot of dark-skinned Native folks, the next thing after them is Black people. And so there's this internalized colorism that happens within community. And when you're trying to have conversations around anti-Black racism within the Indigenous community, oftentimes conversations turn into oppression Olympics. Or we start to dig into the ways in which Black folks have participated or upheld settler colonialism. And so it's complicated, right? Of like holding a community accountable that's done harm to you, and also holding your other community accountable for also doing harm, right? And I think oftentimes when we get into conversations about solidarity, we don't talk about the harm that was done before. And the fact is that due to colonization, lateral violence is a very real thing. And so I always say that you can't kumbaya solidarity. Like, you can't just throw groups into a room and say, okay, let's hold hands, we're going to be fine, right? And so there was a lot of unpacking within myself and being honest about the ways in which I personally and parts of my family have upheld settler colonialism. And then with unpacking anti-Blackness within a Black family, it's extremely hard. Oftentimes, folks assume that Black folks don't have unpacking to do, and we do, right? We live in an anti-Black society. And so unfortunately, that means that we internalize some of that anti-Blackness. And I think a lot of my conversations around anti-Blackness within the Black community has also been conversations around classism. And I think, Bina, what you had mentioned around the caste system, my family's from Trinidad, and we have a huge Indian population in Trinidad, right? And with them came the caste system. And that within Black community, it was interpreted into classism. And so a lot of this, again, is not things that were necessarily a part of our community, but has been adapted in with interacting with other communities and then colonization, right? And so having to unpack classism within my family has been also how I've addressed anti-Blackness. So the way in which my family, who were a part of what we would call lower class, poor class, right? They were a part of that until they came to Canada. And so having that conversation with my family about unpacking the way that they talk about what we call ghetto people in Trinidad, or poor folks, is also unpacking anti-Blackness. What we associate with poverty, oftentimes we associate tropes or stereotypes of marginalized communities in conjunction with poverty, right? And so once you enter into a higher class, whether that's middle class or upper class, you then start to separate yourselves from your own community, from your own kin. And this goes back to what I said before, not seeing the humanity in community, in the people you have kinship with. And so I think that's really where unpacking anti-Blackness comes from. And this is probably going to be my answer for everything, is first finding the humanity within each other, within our communities, but also coming to the table open and honest to unpack the harm and the traumas that you have, right? Because I think when you don't do that work, if you haven't unpacked your traumas or your bias, when you go into that community for solidarity, no matter how much you want to be in solidarity, triggers are going to happen and you're going to cause harm. And then if you're not honest about your community's relationship with this other community, you're going to go in, and when you get called out, you're going to get defensive, right? And so you're going to shut down, which means solidarity is not going to happen. And then again, this is when oppression Olympics come up. And so it's really about seeing humanity, and being honest about yourself and your community when you're interacting with others. And I think that's really how we address anti-Blackness. As a Black person, it's important to me because I'm a Black person, and I want people to see the humanity within me and within my community, right? So yeah, I think it's multifaceted when we're talking about anti-Blackness.
It seems like a very complicated issue, but I often explain to folks, like, when you want to be in solidarity with people, it's really simple. It's really simple. As I said, it's seeing the humanity in others and being honest and open, right? Like, it's not, you don't need a rocket science degree to understand how to see someone else as human. You just do it. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll go next and build on Shanice's excellent points that she brought up about, why is working towards solidarity with Black people and working against anti-Black violence is important to our communities and to us personally. And so I'll start with saying that, when Black Lives Matter was at its height, there was many organizations, including some of the organizations I'm involved with, which are Afghan based organizations, put out solidarity statements with BLM. And then some people were critical of that because they thought that that's just rhetorical, right? That people are all of a sudden kind of bandwagoning on this. But I mean, to me, I think it was important because we, as I said before, we have to be deliberate about it, about our solidarity. And it helped us to pause for a minute and think about, to the question of why it's important to our communities is that our liberation, just like our struggles, are all interconnected. And it really helped us see that. We organized through one of my organizations, Afghan American Artists and Writers Association, a Black studies, African American studies reading group and so forth, just so we could understand more. And oftentimes, as immigrants coming into these countries, we share the same communities, we share the same neighborhoods, we go to school together and so forth. And what happens is there's, never mind between white and Black, but also within people of color groups, there's so much polarization happening. And I think that has to do to what I was saying earlier in my intro, which is that, these overarching structures are so effective at creating divide and conquer strategies, right? That prevent us from seeing the similarities in our oppressions and therefore the way that we can move out of that. And so what you have is, Asian people sharing neighborhoods with Black people, with, Latinx people, with people from all over the world, and almost vying, similar to what Shanice was saying with the oppression Olympics. It's also like vying for limited resources. So people think, we're trained to think that we're all vying for whether it's decent housing or decent school system or decent medical care. But if we come together, these are things that impact all of us negatively. And once again, it's the bigger structures of these societies that keep us in those predicaments and in those difficult circumstances. And so every time I hear people within my own communities or people, I consider us all in the same category, saying like, so-and-so people, are this way or that way, saying negative comments. And I try to like open up dialogue around, no, that's not true. They're not taking all the jobs. They aren't the only ones profiting from this. Or if that's the case, how can we, move beyond that? And so I think that's one of the main ways that, I've been thinking about it, is through the fact that, imperial violence and national violence, and also on a very local level, it's all interconnected. Yeah.
Thank you both. I think that I really love, Shanice, how you keep on going back to kinship and like relationship. And one of the things that, one of the reasons that I'm focusing on South Asian community is because I really believe that there's so much anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism within our communities. And it's too easy to make those moves to innocence if we're in groups with other people so that we can say, oh, but these things happen to us too. And so to be able to have space to be vulnerable, to be reflective, and I find using arts-based activities makes that vulnerability a little bit easier, right? And to say, oh, so here are the things that are at stake for us. Here are the things that, you know, we haven't had a chance to think about in this way because our survival has been focused on other things. So now we need to attend to what other people's survival is focused on and see how we can show up, right? And within the caste system, I mean, the Indigenous people and folks with a lot darker skin are the ones who had been forced to convert to both Hinduism and Islam as members of the lowest caste, right? And so the caste system isn't just a Hindu thing. And so recognizing that every part of what that society is built on that gets moved and transferred with migration means that we have done harm, right? And harm has been done to people. So having those spaces to really address what that looks like, what that has looked like historically, what it looks like now, and how we show up is incredibly important. And so, and whether showing up is, you know, we should bring food when people are taking up space in front of the police headquarters. And we should, you know, or should, I mean, these are things that we can do, right? Like if we can nourish the hearts of other people who are struggling and standing up for things that are most urgent in their communities right then we can find ways to, again, not make it about ourselves. But I think that because anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism is so much a part of a lot of South Asian world making without it being articulated in that way. If we don't parse that out, then anyway, I just keep on saying the same thing, then we lose out. But I think that sometimes people feel like we're in scarcity mode where we don't have enough time to talk about things. And I look forward to being able to create more and more time with people. Jale, I see that your light went on, so I'm assuming that we're running close to time.
This time scarcity mindset, I'm so grateful to the three of you for sharing. And as we think about the urgency, which has been going on really for decades, not just since this more inflamed time of the pandemic and, imperialist invasions, plural, Ukraine being more recent, but Afghanistan being long-term, and of course, colonial theft of land. I'm reminded of the quote from Aurora Levins Morales that says, "Our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on the planet." And so having heard that, or having shared that and heard your conversation today, I want to invite the three of you to share, and you already have in some ways, like what are one or two things you hope people attending today will begin to do? Or what are some things that they can continue doing in order to support liberation of others, especially now, whether you are a mixed race person, whether you are someone who has the experience of being a refugee or forced displacement, or have had your ancestral land stolen, or somebody who lives with a lot of privilege, or somewhere in between, right? We've started to unpack some of those complexities. So just want to invite you all to share quickly one or two things you hope folks in the room today will do.
I think the first thing I think of is start a revolution, but I don't know. I don't know if folks are ready for that. Yeah, that would be my first one. Overthrow the government. Yeah. But outside of that one thing that I wish people would go and do tomorrow, the first one is what I've been saying this whole time, is to realize the humanity in others that you might not have realized before. And I think the second thing is go and be in community with people outside of your own community. Like I can't emphasize this enough. All throughout Black History Month, I noticed a lot of organizations were only hiring Afro-Indigenous folks to speak around Black issues and weren't like navigating conversations with monoracial Black folks or darker skinned Black folks or disabled Black folks. Like they were specifically only utilizing Afro-Indigenous folks because we're more digestible. And so I want you to spend time with members of other communities that don't always have access to you or access to spaces like academics or higher reaching places, right? Like go and spend time with people in other communities in real time. Honor their communities. Don't go in trying to change things. Like I'm not sending you on a missionary trip. Like just go and sit and listen and learn. And if you do that, that's literally the first step I tell everybody in activism, is really like showing up and listening and learning. So those are my two things. Also overthrowing the government, but we can work on that.
I'll follow up on Shanice. I think her point about recognizing the humanity of people is right on. I think that's the key, and that's what the corporate media does, is dehumanize people, as does the security state apparatus, and it creates these divisions, as I've been saying. And so one of the ways that I've seen it to be very effective is to create, and this is something Shanice said also, is to go beyond your communities and seek out those opportunities to meet people, and specifically to expose yourself to new cultural experiences. And so, the way the news frames people and the way, Hollywood and these other types of media frames, marginalized communities is very harmful and dehumanizing. But if you go seek out, music and film and, poetry and all kinds of things directly from different communities, it's a really effective way to connect and see the beauty of different people and their culture and so forth. And then the last thing I would say is to, very gently call out people within our own communities when we hear things that perpetuate stereotypes about other groups of people, right? And it happens. It happens when people share these same neighborhoods where there's scarcity, and people believe that one another is the problem, that their neighbors are the problem, as opposed to seeing, the top-down structures that are keeping us in these positions. And so, like sometimes I'll hear somebody say something here or there that's just, problematic. And so correct, like having a conversation about it. Where does that stem from? And I think that's another approach to it as well.
So I grew up in the 70s and 80s, where we were only allowed to celebrate our cultures in like 2 days of the year, and the rest of the time we're supposed to be ashamed of ourselves or only bring bland food to school. And I think for me, it's so interesting because I think we need to celebrate things too, right? And so we need to do the hard work. We need to be vulnerable. We need to reflect. We need to always learn. And we also need to breathe together sometimes. Conspirators breathe together. And so showing up And finding different ways to do that is so important, right? And you don't have to wait until you've gotten your stuff together to do that, right? And I think revolution happens. I think it has to. And if we hold people accountable in different ways, if we choose to put our energy into to the stuff that grows in more beautiful ways, then our hearts need that too, right? So if we take care of that as well as being politicized and showing up as we can. And as somebody with disabilities, showing up doesn't necessarily just mean taking up space on a street. Showing up is so many different things. I think we need to have space to dream and be hopeful while we're being really realistic about what the revolution needs. And so that might not be as tangible thing. And the fact that we are continuing to learn. I have a deep commitment to helping people have the spaces to learn about themselves and learn about one another. And that openness also needs to be there, right? Hopefully with food. And good music. One thing that Dish for Dish, again, going back to that, really taught me is that it's so good to do deep political work, and then it's so good to dance, right? And laugh and find joy. So if we don't have any hope, then what we continue to create is impacted by that too.
Wonderful. Well, and on that note, I really want to thank our panelists for sharing about everything that you've experienced yourselves and giving us some window into the complexities of this concept of solidarity, which we've been basically problematizing and celebrating throughout our Inclusion Week. Melissa, is there anything else you want to add before we pass it along to Marion for some closing for our Inclusion Week?
I just want to say thank you so much to all the panelists for bringing this insight. And Sabina, joy is definitely a form of resistance. So I really want to leave with that. And yeah, Shanice's point on humanity, not bringing in your trauma, doing that self-reflection. I think all these points are really amazing. So thank you so much for joining us today.
This is Marion speaking. Thank you so much to our panelists today and closing us off in such a good way for Inclusion Week 2022. I want to thank, as I did at the start of the panel and now again have the opportunity to thank the CHREI team for their very hard work. We've had 2 workshops on allyship, kind of part 1 and part 2. This is the second panel sessions, plus our keynote speaker yesterday. It's been an incredible week, an engaging and incredible week. I hope that you found some answers to your questions and some new questions to ask yourself and to form and inform your continued journey of allyship and solidarity. Also want to take the time to thank our ASL and language interpreters. Thank you for allowing our event to be more inclusive. Thank you to the IT staff who helped to ensure that we were able to use the tools to create a virtual environment for a presentation, which allowed more people to attend, different people to attend, but to do so in a safe way. So using Zoom in a good way. I also want to thank the Office of the Vice President, Equity, People and Culture, who we were partnered with through our Insight series to host Professor Ruben Gaztembe Fernandez yesterday. I also want to thank the SCLD, a division of the Vice Provost student, who partnered with us to present our allyship workshops. And more importantly, thank you to everyone here and who attended all of our sessions for wanting to engage in questions of solidarity with us. I'm very grateful. And with that then, we'll finish Inclusion Week 2022 and leading us to questions and excitement about what we can do in 2023. So thank you all. We'll sign off now. Have a lovely day.